Okay, today I'm in Bath with ex-Rails Bookmaker Stephen Little. Thanks very much for agreeing to do this today, Stephen. Can we go to the end, really, please, to begin with? You were the biggest and most famous Rails bookmaker in the country, and you decided to call it a day when the National Joint Pitch Council took over managing the rings. When was that and why was that?
Well, that was in 1999, I think, or was it 1998? And they spent about a year sort of working out the new rules and so on. And during that time, I came to realise that the business was going to change radically. And I think what really worried me was that not only did the NJPC not know what they were doing, they didn't know that they didn't know what they were doing. And they were going to make so many new rules, which I thought didn't make sense. And I wrote any number of letters saying so and explaining why. I think my main objections were they were going to let too many bookies in. Not only too many bookies, but too many bookies who didn't really know what they were going to do and who were only there for fun. And I think in any business it's very difficult to compete with people who don't need to make a profit at it. Another thing was they were going to introduce a rule about attendances. You had to attend 25% of meetings at all your pitches. And I worked it out that I couldn't, even without holidays, or cancellations, I couldn't do 25% at all the pitches I had. And I wanted to be a full-time bookie. I didn't want to have to give pitches up. And during the course of that year, while they were hammering out the rules, I decided, well, it's going to change too much. I'm just not going to enjoy it anymore.
And did you ever regret that decision?
No, I think the more as time went on, the more right I thought I was.
Can you take us back to your beginnings? I mean, was there a family history of bookmaking?
No, my father was in a very different sort of business. He was a vicar.
Okay, so but how did your interest in the racing and bookmaking come from? Where did it come from?
Well, my first taste of bookmaking was at prep school. There was a tradition that boys would make a book on the National each year, and but my last year, this was at the age of 12, somebody else had bagged that, so I thought, well, I'll make a book on the Lincoln, because that was a much bigger race then as part of the big spring double. And so I did that with two partners, and we weren't allowed money at that school, so it had to be in suites. But my two partners and I had a good feed afterwards. That was when Marshall Pill won.
So was that the catalyst when you decided, right, I want to be a bookie?
Not really, no. At the next school I got interested in racing, and eventually went racing for the first time in school holidays in 1960. And then a year or two later, I got more interested and gradually decided, I hadn't really had much thought about what to do as a career. I gradually decided, well, I'd like to be a bookie.
So how did you take your first steps towards becoming a bookie?
Well, I left school at 16, and you can't work in bookmaking till 18, so that was a very good excuse to have a year off, or about a year and a quarter off, which I spent just cycling around race courses. And then after that, I went to London and got a job with a firm called Beresford and Smith, which was part of Heathorns, in New Bond Street in London.
So it was off course?
Yes, that was in the office, and I was there for about 18 months, but although they had Rails pitches, I wanted to go on the racecourse with them, and I didn't look like doing so. So after 18 months I left and started cycling around again.
So who was the first bookmaker you worked for on course?
A bloke called Noel Ray from Harrogate. He had a few Rails pitches. I lived at Lincoln at that time, so I used to, and he had pitches mostly in Yorkshire, and up at Newcastle and such places. So I used to travel up and work for him odd days.
Was he a particularly big layer?
Not really, no, but it was a useful experience.
So those days, it must have been quite lively on the racecourse. Were there any particular bookmakers you looked up to at the time and thought, I want to emulate them?
Well, John Joyce was one of the big bookies. Victor Chandler Senior. There were lots of big bookies then, which, it's a dead race almost. I suppose they're the two names that spring to mind. Bernard Howard was another big one.
So when did you actually become a bookmaker in your own right, and when did you first stand up?
Well, I got my licence in 1971. But slightly before that, I started betting at Bristol Dogs with a man called Vic Gardner, who was an ex-jockey, and we had a half share in a pitch in the outside ring at Bristol Dogs. And after a few years he got fed up with that, so I took over. But I think we started that in late 1970, and then 1971 I got my licence, and the first place I bet was at the Waterloo Cup in 1971.
Okay, the Waterloo Cup, that's been quite a big thing in your career, I remember.
Yes.
You can tell us a bit about that?
Well, I bet I first went in 1968, and I went to every one since, starting betting in 1971. And not only was it my first appearance as a bookmaker, it was my last appearance in my own name in 2005, which was the last Waterloo Cup before coursing was banned in this country.
Back in the days of racecourse bookmaking in the 70s, you would have had to put your name down for pitches, etc. How long did it take to get up the list before you started being allowed to bet?
Well, a long time, because I put my name down. Well, I started off with a few silvering pitches. I think my first tax pitch was either Chepstow or Yarmouth, I can't remember which now. And then, I put my name down for just about everywhere in the South and Midlands. And as an example of how long waiting lists were, I put my name down for Toaster, and by the time I was giving up, I was still only number 6 on the waiting list. Yeah.
So,
but then I started betting, or rather, I got a job betting for someone on the rails, a firm called Thomas Henry Day, who had just a few pitches, and I was the rep, which meant I had to give up the few pitches I had, which, according to the rules, which I knew would happen, and that was a bit of a springboard, really, because after a few years they gave up, and I thought, the only way to get pitches is going to be by applying on the rails, because it was easy to get pitches on the rails then. That was in the days before boards. So I thought, I'll apply for some rails pitches, and I know I'm jumping at the deep end, and I'll either learn to swim or I'll drown.
So how did that work with, I would imagine, limited finances?
Well, as you say, finances were limited, but I think I made some crucial decisions, probably 3 crucial decisions at the time. One was to not to have opinions, just to bet for figures. Another was not to force money, by going over the odds, because that is definitely the way to ruin. So, if the money came, it came, but I wouldn't, if it didn't, I'd just wait until it did. And the third was to, to take any bets that were offered, even if I had to hedge them at lower prices.
That's what I was going to ask you. I remember seeing the adverts in the trade paper when I was quite young, bet with a little man. I think it's prior to Royal Ascot. And if I remember right, you laid some huge bets on some odds-on shots after that. So did you took on all comers regardless of how shrewd they were supposed to be?
Yes. My view was that, I'm trying to make a book, and the more people you've got betting with you, the I won't say easier, but the less hard that is to do. Because if they all want to back, even if the shrewdest, if they all want to back the same horse, only the first one in gets on. But sometimes they'll want to back different horses, and that makes your book.
So did you have a different strategy as time went on for different punters that you sort of thought he can't win, he'll never win, he's lively?
No. If they wanted to back, if they wanted to take the price I was offering, they could be on.
So did you hedge most of what you took?
Well, I hedged quite a lot. Yes. You had to try and balance the book out, not book up. Not that it was always very balanced, but that was the aim.
So was there a figure in your head how much you would risk one for, or would you try and tidy the book up nicely if it was possible?
No, I didn't have a particular figure. How much I'd stand them for, depended on the market really, which you had to have a feel for. And sometimes, of course, I got lumbered and had stood one for too much, and sometimes they won and sometimes they didn't.
One of my old bosses was Ivor Perry, I believe you know. Well, obviously you know me, he worked for you. He said that he was sent to back one back and you still lost 99,000 on the race. How did you used to cope mentally with losses like that?
Well, you just had to. You just had to grit your teeth and pay. So, you just had to swallow and hope for better luck next time.
So what would have been your biggest ever single losing day?
Probably when Frankie Dettori won the 7 races at Ascot.
What sort of figures were we talking about there?
I can't remember the figure, but it was a lot, put it like that.
And what about winning day?
I think the best winning day was probably a Gold Cup day at Cheltenham. But it was only to break level on the meeting, because that was when it was 3 days. The first day was a record losing day. Not only a record losing day, it was more than twice the previous record. The second day was also a bad day, worse than the previous record. And the third day, I just about got it all back. I was virtually allowed to write my own results.
So you mentioned before you take bets off of anybody, but were there any punters in the end that you'd refuse bets point blank from?
Not if I thought their credit was good. No, I certainly refused people if I didn't think they were going to pay, but not because I thought they were going to win.
Now that brings me on to my next question. I imagine that those colossal sums you took, especially talking 20 years ago, were credit bets. How big a problem were knockers in those days?
Well, it was an occupational hazard. If I'd made the decision never to give anyone any credit, I don't think I'd have got anywhere. But certainly, it was a problem. It remains a problem. It's just something you've got to put up with. I do wish, though, that at the time I could have sued people for the bets. Whereas you can now, you couldn't then.
No, I was going to ask that, but it must have been frustrating at the time. Do people still owe now? Can you chase them?
Oh, yes, yeah. It's quite a while since I've actually drawn anything there.
So what was the biggest ever single bet you took? Can you remember?
Well, there are 3 possible answers to that. It depends whether you mean the largest stake or the largest liability or the the largest bet, which is the true measure of a bet, is the takeout. The stake plus the potential winnings. The largest stake was 150,000 on an odds-on in the Gold Cup. In fact, an odds-on shot. The largest liability was 250,000 to 30, I think, at Cheltenham. The largest takeout, I can't actually remember, but probably might have been 100,000 at, I don't know, 94, 52, something like that.
And back in those days, did people really used to come up with plastic bags full?
Not to that extent, but yeah, sometimes they might be tens of thousands. It wouldn't be hundreds of thousands, but yeah, people used to have tens of thousands sometimes in cash.
Did you ever suffer losing runs that made you take a long look into the deep hod and wonder how much more can I lose before I have to turn it in?
Well, yeah, sometimes. I can remember one calendar year that I was still behind, I think in October. I don't mean I'd lost every day, but that year. But I think I was still behind on the year in October and managed to just squeak out in front, I think. But yes, but yeah, if you can't put up with losing runs, you shouldn't be a bookie.
So how did you cope with those times, and could you switch off when you cut on from the races?
Yes, I think so, to some extent, yes.